The story begins in a grim Russian prison, where an executioner faces off against a prisoner in a brutal fight. In the end, the prisoner is killed, but the executioner is soon captured by the prison guards. Meanwhile, in a nearby cell, another prisoner is subjected to a horrific punishment. His tongue is forcibly removed. The next morning, prison officials bury the lifeless bodies of two men in the yard, their deaths adding to the prison's atmosphere of fear and cruelty. The scene shifts to Steelworks No. 8, a factory in Magnitogorsk. Here, an American worker, Kyle LeBlanc, is on the phone with his wife, Gray. At that moment, she playfully urges him to come home quickly, and Kyle promises he'll leave as soon as his shift ends. But fate has other plans. Upon driving home, Kyle decides to call Gray again, but something feels off. Over the phone, he hears unsettling noises, like a struggle. Unbeknownst to him, an intruder has broken into their home and attacked Gray. Panicked, Kyle tries calling the police, but the language barrier makes it impossible for him to explain the situation. Racing against time, he arrives home, only to find that Gray is already dead. Before Kyle can process the situation, the attacker appears and strikes him. Kyle, fueled by grief and anger, fights back, chasing the man out of the house. The chase continues onto a bus, where they wrestle fiercely, smashing through the rear window and landing on the street. At one point, a speeding motorbike rushes past, running over Kyle's hand as the killer escapes. Moments later, the police arrive and arrest Kyle. Some time later, Kyle is being transported in a prison bus, haunted by memories of his trial. He recalls how Sergio, the man who murdered Gray, was set free due to insufficient evidence. Kyle had desperately objected to the judge's decision, only to learn from his lawyer that Sergio's wealthy family had bribed officials. Out of anger, Kyle took the bailiff's gun during the trial and shot Sergio in court. Because of this action, Kyle's fate was sealed as he would be sent to prison without parole. Kyle's new life begins in the notorious Krvavy prison, ruled by the ruthless and corrupt General Hrushchev. Upon arrival, the general makes an example of a prisoner who had attempted to escape, showing the others his mangled body after being run over by a car. The grim welcome sets the tone for the new inmates. Soon after, the prisoners are led to a processing room, where they are ordered to strip off their clothes and hand over any belongings. When Talik, a sadistic prison officer, demands Kyle's wedding ring, Kyle refuses. His defiance enrages Talik, who beats Kyle savagely and takes the ring by force. The new inmates are then marched off for head shavings and body cleaning, stripped of any remnants of their past lives. Finally, they are crammed into overcrowded barracks, with rows of bunk beds stacked tightly together. That night, Kyle sat alone in his dimly lit cell, still trying to adjust to the harsh reality of prison life. He held a photo of Gray, and memories of their happy times together filled his mind. The warmth of those moments stood in stark contrast to the cold, cruel world he now faced. As Kyle tried to make sense of his surroundings, he noticed his cellmate, Billy Cooper, being led away by prison guards. Their destination was another room, where an inmate named Andre was waiting to exploit him. At that moment, Kyle could only watch, powerless to intervene. The next morning, as the prisoners gathered, Kyle saw Billy return. His face was bruised, and his spirits seemed shattered. The signs of Andre's abuse were evident. Kyle's anger boiled over when he looked at Andre. His face reminded him of Sergio, the man who had taken Gray from him. Overcome with rage, Kyle launched himself at Andre, attacking him violently. As a result, guards quickly restrained Kyle and dragged him away to solitary confinement. The solitary cell was a nightmare. Dark, filthy, and suffocating, it felt more like a tomb than a prison cell. During this time, Kyle refused to eat, letting the food sit untouched as he starved himself. His mind began to spiral, and despair set in. At his lowest point, he even tried to do the unthinkable, but his attempt failed. One day, as Kyle lay weak, a butterfly fluttered into the cell and landed gently on his forehead. The small creature brought back vivid memories of Gray and their life together. The butterfly then flew to the tray of food left for him, as if signaling him to hold on and fight for his life. Inspired by this tiny glimmer of hope, Kyle decided to survive. After several days, Kyle was released from solitary confinement and assigned a new cellmate, a mysterious prisoner known only as Number 451. Before Kyle could settle in, Talik warned him that 451 had killed 3 of his previous cellmates. Because of this, fear gripped Kyle as he realized the danger of his new situation. The next morning, the prisoners were marched outside to perform grueling manual labor under the scorching sun. Exhaustion was written across their faces, and the relentless heat only added to their suffering. Later, Kyle received a visit from his brother-in-law, Paul, who told him that Gray had been buried in Louisiana, in a peaceful spot near trees and flowing water. He also advised Kyle to pay bribes to the prison staff if he wanted to make life behind bars more bearable. The visit offered little comfort, but gave Kyle insight into the harsh realities of navigating prison life. One afternoon, while Kyle walked across the yard, a ball thrown by Andre narrowly missed him and struck a member of another gang. Tensions flared, and a fight broke out between the two groups. At that moment, Talik intervened, announcing that if they wanted to settle their differences, they could do so in the prison arena. After the commotion, Kyle approached Billy and introduced himself. Billy shared his story. He had been sentenced to 18 months for driving drunk and crashing into a restaurant. Their conversation was soon joined by another inmate, Malachi, who revealed some chilling truths about Andre. At that moment, Malachi explained that Andre was part of the mafia and had the guards in his pocket, allowing him to run the prison from the shadows. Late that night, Kyle's nightmares returned. The haunting memories of his wife's murder left him restless and murmuring in his sleep. His cellmate, 451, visibly annoyed, got up and covered Kyle's mouth to quiet him. The sudden act jolted Kyle awake. He stared at 451, uneasy, and firmly asked him never to do that again. The next day, the prisoners gathered in the dusty field to watch one of the regular fights. These brutal events were organized by General Hrushchev, who used them to gamble and rake in profits with his friends. The crowd roared with excitement, eager for the violent spectacle. In the ring, Andre was one of the fighters. He faced off against another inmate in a savage battle. The fight was intense, with blows exchanged relentlessly, but in the end, Andre emerged victorious. Seeing this, the crowd erupted in cheers, but 451 remained indifferent, quietly engrossed in a book, completely ignoring the chaos around him. As night descended, Billy was in the cell, nervously brushing his toothbrush against the wall, seemingly trying to prepare himself. Moments later, guards came and dragged him away to a room where Andre was waiting. Clutching the toothbrush tightly, Billy tried to defend himself, but the fight ended tragically. Andre stabbed him with a knife, leaving Billy lifeless. The following day, Kyle, while working outside, got into a scuffle with another inmate. Despite explaining that he didn't want to fight, the guards on duty encouraged the others to attack him. Outnumbered and beaten, Kyle was sent back to solitary confinement. In the isolation of his cell, Kyle felt the crushing weight of loneliness. He tapped on the wall, hoping to communicate with the prisoner next door. To his surprise, a butterfly appeared again, fluttering softly around him. It gave him a faint sense of connection, a symbol of life amidst the darkness. However, his thoughts were interrupted by the muffled sounds of someone being beaten outside his cell. Kyle couldn't tell who it was, but felt the pain of helplessness. After several days, Kyle was released from solitary and returned to his original cell. There, he found a diary written by 451. As he flipped through the pages, he was struck by the raw hatred in the words. The diary seemed to echo his own feelings of despair, but also stirred something within him, a bitter resolve to keep fighting. Just as Kyle became engrossed in the writings, 451 returned to the cell. Uncomfortable under his cold gaze, Kyle quickly set the diary aside and left him alone. Later, during mealtime, Andre taunted Kyle, mentioning he was going to enjoy Billy that night. Kyle's anger exploded. Unable to contain his fury, he punched Andre, and a vicious fight broke out. The guards soon intervened, dragging Kyle away and once again sending him to solitary confinement. At the same time, 451 observed the chaos from afar, unfazed, and returned to his book as though nothing had happened. In another part of the prison, a group of inmates working in forced labor stumbled upon an abandoned mine. Without warning, the mine exploded, killing 2 prisoners instantly. Amidst the chaos, Billy saw an opportunity to escape with another inmate. However, their attempt was short-lived. The guards quickly intervened, shooting Billy's companion on the spot. In the end, Billy was recaptured and dragged back to the prison, his brief taste of freedom crushed. Meanwhile, Kyle, isolated in his solitary cell, channeled his rage and despair into relentless physical training. Every day, he pushed his body to its limits, his muscles growing stronger and his appearance transforming. His once vulnerable face now carried a hardened, almost menacing expression. Time passed, and Kyle was eventually entered into the brutal fight tournaments organized by General Khrushchev. His first opponent was none other than Andrei. Despite all his training, Kyle struggled against Andrei's sheer strength and brutality. The fight was intense, and Kyle was beaten down, lying almost lifeless on the ground. Seizing the moment, Andrei dragged Kyle toward an iron pole, ready to finish him off. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Kyle kicked Andrei to the ground. Desperate and fueled by survival instincts, Kyle lunged at Andrei and bit into his neck, killing him in a savage act of defiance. When Kyle returned to his cell after the fight, 451 asked him how it felt to win. However, Kyle didn't respond. He simply shook his head, tears streaming silently down his face. Over time, Kyle began to dominate the fights, winning match after match. His victories became infamous, even causing General Khrushchev's wealthy friends to lose money in their gambling bets. Yet, these victories came at a cost. Kyle realized he had fallen into the guards' trap, becoming a pawn in their game of violence. Each fight drained him, leaving his body and mind increasingly broken. Outside the prison walls, Kyle's brother-in-law, Paul, continued his efforts to secure Kyle's release through his connections with the American embassy in Russia. But Kyle, consumed by his inner torment, refused Paul's help, unwilling to leave on those terms. On the day of the Russian independence celebration, the prison hosted a festive event. Amid the noise and activity, Billy approached Kyle with a secret. He whispered that he planned to make another escape attempt that very night. Around the same time, a new inmate named Valya arrived. Valya introduced himself to Kyle with a firm handshake that bordered on a challenge, gripping his hand tightly as if to test him. Later that night, Billy made his move, sneaking through the shadows in an attempt to flee. Unfortunately, the guards caught him before he could get far. Billy was dragged to a room where he was tortured mercilessly. The reason for his failure soon became clear. Malachi had betrayed him. Under pressure from the guards, Malachi had revealed Billy's plan in exchange for treatment for his own injuries. The following afternoon, Billy lay on the floor, weak and broken after being brutally tortured by Valya. With his last breath, he turned to Kyle and begged him not to let the people in prison change your own identity, but still be your true self. Moments later, Billy passed away, leaving Kyle with his final words echoing in his mind. One afternoon, Kyle was forced to face Valya in the fighting arena. As the crowd jeered and General Khrushchev watched expectantly, Kyle crouched at the edge of the arena, refusing to fight. At that moment, Valya attacked him repeatedly, but Kyle stood firm, letting Billy's words guide him. His defiance infuriated the general. That night, as punishment, Kyle was dragged to the center of the prison yard and tied to a post, left to endure the harsh condition day and night. Other inmates passed by, glancing at him with sympathy and admiration for his silent rebellion. Meanwhile, 451 sought revenges. He cornered Malachi and, in a moment of cold fury, doused him with gasoline before setting him ablaze. It was payback for Malachi's betrayal of Billy, a brutal justice carried out in the shadows of the prison. The next day, the power dynamic in the prison shifted. The gangsters, tired of being used as pawns, banded together and refused to participate in the fights. They declared they would no longer kill their fellow inmates for the general's amusement. As a result, without fighters, Khrushchev's operation began to unravel. Meanwhile, Kyle, now weak and on the verge of collapse, was taken down from the post and moved to the clinic for treatment. Once he had recovered, he was sent back to solitary confinement, where he resumed his habit of tapping on the walls to communicate with the inmate in the next cell. But Khrushchev wasn't done with Kyle. One day, he unleashed an executioner to eliminate him. The executioner stormed into Kyle's cell, determined to kill him. As Kyle lay weak, he instinctively tapped on the wall, just as he had done so many times before. Seeing this, the executioner paused, then mimicked the tapping. At that moment, realization dawned. This was the same inmate Kyle had been communicating with. Overwhelmed with emotion, the executioner hugged Kyle, recognizing him as a friend. Their connection was cut short when Talik burst into the cell, aiming a gun at Kyle. The executioner shielded Kyle, taking the bullet and dying in his place. The prisoners, enraged by the senseless violence, rose up in rebellion. Soon after, chaos erupted throughout the prison as inmates attacked the guards, igniting a full-scale riot. Meanwhile, Kyle knelt beside the executioner's lifeless body, covering his face with a jacket as a final act of respect. Then, he returned to his cell, where 451 handed him a collection of documents, proof of the murders and corruption that had plagued the prison for decades. 451 then assured Kyle that the evidence would help them escape, but there was one final obstacle. Kyle had to face Valia in a last fight. Some time later, the day of the fight arrived. General Khrushchev, furious and desperate, ordered his guards to kill Kyle regardless of the fight's outcome. In the arena, Valia fought dirty, pulling out a hidden knife. Despite the odds, Kyle defeated him. However, before he could celebrate his victory, guards swarmed him and dragged him away. Meanwhile, 451 used a secret tunnel, assisted by another inmate, to infiltrate the workshop where Kyle was being held for execution. Together, they overpowered the guards. During this chaos, Kyle attacked Talik, reclaiming the wedding ring he had stolen and taking his uniform as a disguise. Using his disguise, Kyle stole Khrushchev's car and drove out of the prison. At the same time, 451 slipped into Khrushchev's office. In a gruesome act of vengeance, he silenced the corrupt general forever by ripping out his tongue before killing him. In the film's final scenes, Kyle successfully escapes. 3 months later, Krvavi prison is shut down, a grim reminder of the suffering that took place within its walls. So the moral of the story is, sometimes life throws you in a pit, but if a butterfly can vibe with your misery, maybe it's time to fight dirty, chew through your problems, and steal a car while you're at it.